Evening, welcome everyone to our conversation this evening on the weaponization of procedure with our distinguished panel, Professor Wendy Schiller, Rich Arenberg, Alan Frumin, and Marty Paone. I'm Susan Moffett. I'm the director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy here at Brown. Welcome, so good to see you all here tonight. The Taubman Center focuses its research and its programming on three themes: the cost of living, the value of democracy, and the price of security. And Professor Arenberg's new book, Congressional Procedure, certainly speaks to one of our key institutions in American democracy, the U.S. Congress. I very much look forward to our conversation tonight on how we got to where we are and where do we go from here. But before we dive into that conversation, I'd like to introduce our panelists in order. Richard Arenberg is a visiting professor of the practice of political science and a senior fellow in international and public affairs here at Brown. We're fortunate that he brings to us more than 34 years of experience on Capitol Hill, where he worked in a range of senior staff positions. He is an expert on congressional rules and procedures and congressional history, and co-authored the prize-winning book, Defending the Filibuster, the Soul of the Senate. Thank you, Rich, for your newest book, Congressional Procedure, which is the focal point of our conversation tonight. Also joining us is Alan Frumin, who brings extensive expertise on Congress from his 35 years working in the Senate Parliamentarian's Office. His 35 years and 1 month tenure in the Senate Parliamentarian's Office is the longest such tenure in the history of that office. His entire career has been devoted to giving nonpartisan, authoritative, congressional procedural advice to generations of senators, Senate staffs, and others interested in the workings of Congress. He is the editor of Riddick's Senate Procedures, which Professor Schiller also has, which is
that I've read a lot of
which is the official authoritative compilation of Senate precedents. We're also pleased to welcome Martin Paone, who is currently Senior Advisor at Prime Policy Group. He previously spent 29 years working on the Senate floor for the Democratic leadership in various capacities. He also spent 2 years working for President Obama as his Deputy Assistant for Legislative Affairs and Senate Liaison. He's widely regarded as an expert in Senate procedure. He also served as an advisor to the show House of Cards, working on the set and with the writers in 2013. And moderating our discussion tonight is Dr. Wendy Schiller, Professor of Political Science and Chair of the Political Science Department here at Brown. She is an expert on Congress and on representation in American politics. Among her many publications include 4 books. Her most recent is Electing the Senate, Indirect Democracy Before the 17th Amendment, and also her first book is Partners and Rivals, Representation in the U.S. Senate Delegations. Thank you for moderating tonight. So our time together will unfold in the following way. We'll begin with a discussion from Rich Arenberg, about 10 minutes on some key points in his book, and then each of our panelists will offer about 10 minutes of commentary. Professor Schiller has some questions, and then we'll open it up to your questions as well. We are a full house tonight, which is wonderful, but it is a reminder to all of us to be mindful of our airtime. When it is your time to ask a question, please ask one direct question and then share the air with your colleagues. I also want to remind you that our conversation tonight is being recorded, and that includes the questions and answers. And then after our conversation here in the Joukowsky Forum, I hope you will join us all in the foyer of the Watson Institute for reception and book signing with Rich Arenberg, and another opportunity for us to continue our conversation. Now, will you please join me in very warmly welcoming Professor Schiller, Professor Arenberg, Alan Frumin, and Marty Paone.
Well, you were very kind to describe me as an expert in congressional rules and procedures. I'll accept that mantle, but only with great humility, since the two gentlemen to my left know more about congressional rules, procedures, and history than any two other people that you could find anywhere in this nation. So we're very fortunate to have them here. For most people, when they look at Congress, it's largely a black box. People understand much of what goes in to the Congress, much of what goes in on the conveyor belt, and when things come out, which is rarer and rarer these days, when things come out, people recognize that as well. But largely what happens in the middle, that process, for most people is a black box. And my book really is an effort to open that box up, to write about the rules and procedures in a way that's accurate, but in a way that's accessible to people who want to understand what's happening in Congress. Much of the media coverage of the Congress, as we know, goes almost immediately to personalities, to conflict. That's what generates ratings, and that's much of what we see. And so sometimes, even as educated and interested people, we have a difficult time decoding what it is that is in fact going on. So much of what is reported is not about the nitty-gritty of what's going on, about how things are proceeding or why they're not proceeding. And it's what Woodrow Wilson famously called the dance of legislation. So the argument I want to make to you tonight is that procedures matter. They matter very significantly. And when we talk about the Congress, it's those procedures and rules and traditions that are the protector, the ultimate protector of stability, comity with a T, sometimes with a D, but most of the time with a T, and fair play in the House and the Senate. The protector is procedure. So procedures in the Congress are, in fact, the in-house version of the rule of law. In the words of former Supreme Court Justice Felix Frankfurter, the history of American freedom is in no small measure the history of procedure. So much of my book is focused on explaining what is commonly referred to as the regular order. That's the normal legislative procedures established by the traditions, the rules, and the precedents. The process of lawmaking, as we all recognize, has in recent years become increasingly afflicted by a constant cycle of procedural tactics deployed by the majority and the response of obstruction and delay by the minority. So we've seen almost a constant tit for tat. And we hear the refrain, of course, over and over again, why can't they just get along on Capitol Hill? Why can't they just address the nation's problems? We've got big problems and they're not addressing them. They're just involved in this seemingly endless guerrilla warfare. Our politics have become increasingly polarized. Political parties have become more closely aligned ideologically. And as a result, the congressional leadership has become increasingly centralized and become more aggressively partisan. The parties have moved farther and farther apart through this process of action and reaction. And in fact, I think, as these gentlemen will attest, people who have spent a lot of time on the Senate floor, they know really that both sides feel aggrieved, that both sides think the other side is doing something below the belt to them. And as a result, at first opportunity, they give it back in kind. And so we've seen this kind of constant, it amounts to an erosion in the procedural stability of the institution. And I see it as cyclical. There's a lot of my students in the room, and they'll laugh when I crank my arm because I often talk about polarization as almost a perpetual motion machine, that each upsetting action leads to an upsetting reaction and another spin of the wheel. And we've seen it over and over again, virtually year by year, repeating these cycles of action and reaction. Procedure, tradition, and precedent have been used for short-term partisan gain increasingly. This is what I've come to term the weaponization of procedure. This is exacerbated and exacerbates the decline in civility and the near constant vilification of the opposition that we see on the floor. There are many elements to the use and abuse, the weaponization of procedure. I'll just mention one to kind of get us started, and it's one I'm sure that you've heard a fair amount about, and it's gained the label the nuclear option. The nuclear option was a reaction to what was largely seen, widely seen as abuse of the Senate's filibuster rule. Most of you probably know that in the Senate, it takes a supermajority, it takes 60 votes to get much of anything of consequence done, with exceptions, but that's the general rule. And that filibuster, which was rarely used historically in the Senate, there was great restraint. Senators, when I first got to Washington, all senators kind of recognized that these rules, they could be used in combat, but only with great restraint. That if they were overused, if they were seen as abused, then they were going to be swept away by the tide. And for those of us who know and love the Senate and believe that it plays a unique role in our system, we believe that this supermajority requirement means that the majority can only do things in the Senate usually with the buy-in of some of the minority. And this fosters an institution in which the two sides have to come together, have to negotiate, have to work to a certain extent together. Of course, I'm sure many of you look perplexed because we don't see the Senate doing that so much these days. But this is because of the corrosion of this behavior, and it's become increasingly difficult to get both sides even to come to the table to negotiate. And,
1 minute.
okay. So let me just say quickly about the nuclear option. It was a procedure that was undertaken in the Senate to strip away the ability to filibuster on judicial nominations. I argued in my first book that this was a terrible idea, that it would undermine the courts, that it would damage the Senate's responsibility for confirming judges. And as I like to say, in order to prove my point, I used to have to invent worst-case scenarios. Well, if you're a Democrat, you've seen the worst-case scenario actually occur in the Kavanaugh hearings, where the minority, stripped of this leverage, stripped of the ability to require the majority to take them into consideration, either in the nomination or the way the confirmation hearings were conducted, or in terms of turning over the files, as you may remember, or the FBI investigation. If the filibuster still existed, in those situations, the Democrats would have been able to say, no files, no confirmation.
Okay, that's a great
Okay,
place to stop
I'll stop
for now.
right there.
We
Thank
will
you.
return to all sorts of things, executive nominations, in addition to judicial nominations.
Right.
And the sequence, I hope it will learn from 2013 all the way through recent changes in the rules to further limit this ability. There is one seat actually open in front, if you want to come down for it. Green sweater, you've been, yeah. Nope, not you, the woman behind you. That's right, you. There's one seat right here, so you were the first to come and stand, so there's a seat right there. I do this to students all the time in class. They don't enjoy it. Okay. So I believe next in line is Alan Frumin. You want to go next?
Sure.
Okay, great.
So much to say, so little time. I'll try to be brief. Those of you who might know me realize that that's really a bridge too far. I want to start out by commending Rich, Professor Arenberg, to you for what he has done in his Senate career and for what he's attempted to do, and I believe succeeded in doing in his post-Senate career, and that's bring the Senate to you, to the students here at Brown, and to those who care about our public forum generally throughout the country. Rich has taken on the unpopular topics, explaining the Senate, defending the filibuster. And I've kidded Rich in the past that the title of his first book, Defending the Filibuster, the Soul of the Senate, I think that those phrases are in that order so that he can sell the movie rights. But I think it should really be Defending the Soul of the Senate, of which the filibuster is a messy but necessary component. It doesn't really have the sexy ring that Rich's title has, but it is the truth of the situation. Defending the filibuster is the soul of the Senate. The soul of the Senate is consensus policymaking. It's the only institution in our federal government where those not in power are not powerless. And it has developed that way over the years. There's nothing that mandated that the Senate work this way. But it's the Senate as an institution, it's the culture of the institution as it has developed over the years, over the last 2 centuries, that produced this truly unique institution where the minority party has some say. Now, over the years, we would, and I have to catch myself in speaking to groups, I would speak of the rights of the minority in the Senate, and then I'd slap my hand and say, well, there are no rights in the Senate for the minority, there were privileges. And there were privileges granted to the Senate minority by its majority. And the minority had the privilege to obstruct. The minority had the privilege to say no. You can always say no by voting no, but in the Senate you get to say hell no by voting against cloture. So unlike a simple majoritarian body where you just count the numbers, in the Senate it's quite different. And the Senate's rules and precedents reflected that. The rules and precedents and practices really do go to the culture of the institution and to how the component parts of that institution, the senators from the various states, interact with each other as human beings and interact with each other as representatives of their states. The privileges granted to Senate minorities over the years have been jealously guarded over the years. And what I like to tell people is that the Senate is on the one hand, the Senate does not appear to represent American values. The Senate is not majoritarian, and it's certainly not efficient. But I'd like to think that the byplay of minority privileges, where the minority has a buy-in, where the minority, some members of the minority have to participate in order for legislation to go forward, and previously, in order for nominations to go forward, that's a critically important thing. You don't want half the country to feel that they have no voice. And in the Senate, it's the one place where the political minority has had a voice and has had leverage. And taking that away is a terrible thing. If there's a tooth fairy or a genie or somebody who grants wishes, one wish, maybe Tom Brady grants wishes, I don't know. My wish would be that we amend the Constitution, and I think it's Article 1, Section 3, Clause 2, we're going to fact check that in a minute, that deals with the qualifications to be a U.S. Senator. And some of you know what the qualifications are. You have to be 30 years of age, you have to be a citizen for 9 years, unlike 7 years for the lower body, and you have to be a resident of the state that you represent. Did I get the section right? Clause 3, Article 1, Section 3, Clause 3?
Section 3.
Okay, all right, stand corrected. What I would do is I would amend that to say responsible adults only. And I would put that sign on the door to the Senate, responsible adults only. This is a complex mechanism. This is a complex mechanism that has evolved over the years and has served the country well. It's a complex mechanism that got us through the Civil War and all of the strife leading up to that and all of the strife since. It has worked. It has worked by allowing the minority to have some say. It's to my way of thinking, that's truly representative of American values. It really does represent, in a more meaningful manner, the consent of the governed, because the governed consists of both the majority party in power and the minority party out of power. And the Senate has guarded that jealously until very recently by giving the minority and respecting the minority's prerogatives. The nuclear option, I don't think you'll find anybody across this table who thinks it was a good thing. Professor Arenberg was sounding that horn years ago when the Democrats, duly frustrated, and I do think that I think Harry Reid, the Democratic leader, the majority leader, was right to do something, but he was wrong to do as much as he did. He was provoked, I believe, by unprecedented opposition and obstruction from Mitch McConnell and the Republicans. They goaded him, and he took the bait. And now the Democrats, some of them will say it in public that they regret what they did in 2013. But most of them certainly would regret it and admit that to each other. And I dare say a fair number of people who pulled the Democratic lever are sorry that the Democrats did what they did in 2013, inviting Mitch McConnell to extend the nuclear option to Supreme Court justices. Anyway, happy to talk more about this. I know there's going to be a Q&A. I want to keep my remarks short, so I will stop right there.
Thank you very much. Okay, our next speaker is, do you want Martin or Marty?
Marty's fine.
Marty, and is it Paone?
Paone.
Paone. I'm from New York, so I would have said Paone, but I want to make sure. From Prime Policy Group and formerly the Senate, and a lot of different jobs in the Senate. So why don't you take it away, and we'll go for about 10 minutes, and then I'll have some questions, and we'll open it up.
Sure. I too want to compliment Rich on his excellent job in making the way Congress works, the House and the Senate, accessible to the layman and to even our staff. I mean, I myself enjoyed the chapters on the House side because that was always a black box for me, having spent my life in the Senate. The history of the Congress is replete with stories of people whose knowledge of procedure gave them a disproportionate impact on events. The Senate website, and Alan touched on this, it describes the Senate as follows. The legislative process on the Senate floor reflects a balance between the rights guaranteed to senators under the standing rules and the willingness of senators to forego exercising some of these rights in order to expedite the conduct of business. Well, unfortunately, the Senate that Rich and Alan and I worked in for so many years, that doesn't exist any longer. That was a much more open, wild and woolly place, so to speak, where the leaders would call up a bill, usually by unanimous consent. You didn't need a motion to proceed, cloture vote. And then they would leave the floor, go to their offices, and leave a ranking and chairman there with their staff to deal with whoever would walk in with amendments. And the floor staff would help them and help the senators in offering amendments and try to put some sort of order to the chaos. But unless it was an appropriations bill or a budget resolution or something dealing with the Budget Act that had limitations on what you could offer, in the Senate, there's no germaneness restriction. So you could be on a farm bill and somebody in the front page of the Post that morning, there was something on the Middle East peace process or lack of, and somebody would walk in and offer an amendment on the Middle East. And you would tell the chairman and ranking member and the staff, like, well, let's put in a quorum here, which is another word for timeout in the Senate. And while we go call the chairman and ranking member of the Foreign Relations Committee and let them know that this is pending, and they may want to come over and talk on this. And they would probably come over, and you might spend the next 3 days dealing with amendments on foreign relations to the Farm Bill. The farm conferees didn't like it much because you had to appoint people from the Foreign Relations Committee, but you might actually adopt something like that. Those days don't happen anymore. Now, the place has changed to the point where leaders of both parties have done this, and they continue to do it. They call up a bill, they get a bill, unfortunately, a bill that they can get cloture usually on the motion to proceed, because they need that. And you have to have cloture on almost everything now. And you get it up, and a leader will fill the amendment tree, denying everybody on both sides of the aisle, majority and minority, the ability to offer amendments. And then they'll say, all right, let's negotiate a time agreement on who gets to offer what amendments. Well, that was completely reversed to the way we used to live it. The leaders would call up the bill, we might be on that bill for a couple of weeks, and people would offer amendments, and you'd vote on them. And then near the end of maybe a week or two, we'd get an agreement, what we used to call, in quotes, finite list that might have over 100 amendments on it with like 2, 3, or 4 word descriptions, and say, okay, these are now the only amendments left in order. And that might be on a Tuesday. And then, but by Thursday, and the leaders would threaten to work late on Thursday, midnight, 1 a.m. was not unusual, and in return, the carrot and the stick for finishing the bill that night would be no votes on Friday, because they actually did have votes on Friday in those days. You don't see that right now. They usually cut off voting by midday on Thursdays now in the Senate. But you'd go around and the floor staff would talk to members and say, 10 o'clock at night, do you still want to offer this amendment? We've got you on this list. And they say, no, I'd much rather get out of here tonight or not be here tomorrow. But they could say that because they knew their right to offer it to another bill later was like just coming up. Now they don't have that right. And so if the leader can't get cloture on something, then he just calls the opposition, usually the Democrats, in this case now the minority, obstructionists, and they move on. Trent Lott did that on a regular basis in 2000, and he lost 5 seats. And he admitted to me, I guess that didn't do me much good protecting my members from certain votes. Harry Reid did it in 2014, and he lost the Senate. And some members were defeated in that election because they were criticized for not having been there for 6 years, and they never had an amendment passed with their name on it, because the control has gotten that tight. And so the place has changed. The nuclear option that Reid exercised in 13 was unfortunate. But before that, in January of 13, they started off that Congress in a much more kumbaya mood. They passed what is called a standing order, which was a resolution, Senate resolution. It was made changes in how nominations were debated for just that Congress. It expired, had a built-in expiration date at the end of that Congress. And it said that if you weren't a cabinet level or a Supreme Court or circuit court nominee, and you got cloture on your nomination, the time was not 30 hours, but 8 hours, and it was equally divided, 4 hours a side. So one side could immediately yield back 4 hours, and you get the nomination done in 4 if you invoke cloture, which is a lot better than 30. And And if you were a district judge, and you got cloture, or you needed cloture, and the cloture was invoked, it was only 2 hours equally divided. So you could see, you could process nominations a whole lot quicker that way. Well, that's January. By the fall, by November, relations, as Alan and Rich have talked about, had gotten so bad that Reed exercised the nuclear option and lowered the cloture threshold for all nominations to a majority vote except Supreme Court nominations. But before we got to that point, though, one of the things that when we passed that resolution in January of 13, that standing order, there was a colloquy, which is a scripted conversation between two leaders, two members. In this case, it was McConnell asking Reed a question. And McConnell said, well, nothing in this standing order that we're doing is going to affect a senator's ability to demand to be consulted on judges and that affect their state and to require their approval. That's called the blue slip. And Reed said, no, of course not. So they go ahead and they do that. So basically the Republicans used that blue slip ability. Democrats were in control for that time of the committee. And if they didn't approve of a nominee that the Obama's administration had sent up, a judge nominee, that person didn't go anywhere. They didn't get a vote, nothing. So they kept seats open that they're now filling under Trump, using the blue slip policy. When Grassley became chairman of Judiciary in January of 15, he adhered to it also. Obama was still in there. Fast forward to post-Trump, now Senator McConnell is quoted as saying, well, that blue slip, that was never meant to be a blackball. I mean, that's really advisory, especially on circuit court nominees. So he told Grassley, you don't adhere to it for Trump on a circuit court. And they have processed nominees that Democrats did not return the blue slip on. So, this is just to give you some of the color of the tit for tat that continues. This is why both sides have had instances where they feel the other side has aggrieved them and they're going to react if they ever take over. Which I'll finish by saying that, yes, what Reed did was extreme, but he felt that he was dealing with an extreme situation. They were using the filibuster to not only keep some nominations from going forward, judges, but they were denying the ability to fill quorums on various boards and commissions like the NLRB or the director of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, because they didn't like these boards, Ex-Im Bank. And, that was usually what we did with those sort of nominations is, we'd hold up the one party's nominee because we were waiting for the Democratic, companion to come along, and we'd do them in pairs. But denying quorums just because you didn't like that body, like the NLRB, that went another step further, in our opinion, in the Democrats' opinion, as to what they were doing. And one of the reasons, and then the final straw was the D.C. Circuit. The D.C. Circuit is, next to the Supreme Court, one of the more important circuits because it deals with federal government decisions before it gets to this. And so a lot of them are decided there, they don't get to the Supreme Court. The Gang of 14, the nuclear option title, description came from the Bush era. We were threatening to filibuster Bush judges. The Gang of 14 said, it was 7 Democrats and 7 Republicans said, no, we will not allow you, Majority Leader Republican, to change the rules by nuclear option because we won't vote for that. But we think that all nominations should at least get a vote unless there's extreme reason not to vote for them. And so it took away the nuclear option from Bush's era, but it also took away the ability to filibuster some D.C. Circuit nominees that a lot of Democrats didn't like. Kavanaugh was one of them. He got confirmed to the D.C. Circuit in that agreement. You fast forward to Obama trying to fill those three seats on that D.C. Circuit, and the Republicans were arguing, well, there's not really a big caseload there. They don't really need to fill those seats. Well, the reason they were making that argument was the Republican judges that had taken that had retired, opening up those slots, had taken senior status. And they meant they continued to hear cases and be involved in decisions. As a result, the Republicans had a majority on that DC circuit. And that was the straw that broke the camel's back. And that's why Reed did what he did. He left it open for Supreme Court nominees, which we saw how long it took McConnell to change that. And so I'm of the mind that, yes, it was extreme, but anybody that thinks that McConnell wouldn't have done the same with a Republican Senate and a Republican president with Democrats filibustering their nominees, well, I've got a blue slip to sell you. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm just going to throw out a couple of questions, and then we'll go to the audience. So for the audience's perspective now, moving forward, could you just give us a little bit of a handle on what you think the actual power of Democrats in the Senate now, having lost a couple of seats in 2018 in the Senate? What's their power now to thwart any major changes in policy? In other words, what's their potential to use the filibuster in legislative situations rather than nomination situations? And even on nominations, Schumer has been pulling some tricks out of his hat to try to continue to delay as much as he can frequently. But on the other side of the fence, we see a record number of vacancies in the Trump administration, across the board, across cabinet agencies, across departments. He can't even get people who will get confirmed as cabinet secretaries. He's got a lot of 6 or 7 acting cabinet secretaries, because everybody he comes up with, his own party says, we don't think we can do that, even though they've changed the rules, and the majority party can easily clear the president's executive nomination. So tell us a little bit about the impact now, particularly given the Trump administration, and what tools the Democrats as a minority party in the Senate have to block both nominations or delay them or stall them, and then policy changes coming down the pike from the president or the majority party. So if each of you want to take that question, then I have one more, and it's a little bit different.
Well, I would start by saying that it makes, of course, an enormous difference that the Democrats have taken control of the House, because it completely changes the dynamic in the Senate. Because the House Democrats, first of all, you no longer have the House Republicans sending all this legislation over to the Senate that needed to be blocked using the filibuster. So the Senate Democrats are not so much in that position today. But we see, the tit for tat on all sorts of different fronts. The Republicans, when they had both houses, attempted to use what we know as the budget reconciliation process, which is a process that was created in 1974 under the Budget Act. It was supposed to be just a little minor procedure to kind of tweak legislation. And over the years, because it had what we call expedited procedures, meaning you could not filibuster it, it became an enormous loophole through which the majority tried to drive whatever legislation they wanted to get done. And you just saw the Republicans do it a year or two ago in attempting to use reconciliation in a way completely disconnected from the way it was intended, to use it to repeal Obamacare.
Which
for
was also
example.
passed under reconciliation. Obamacare itself, the Affordable Care Act, was also passed under reconciliation.
was
No, it
modified.
wasn't.
It was
Well,
modified.
all right.
No, it wasn't.
Could have sworn there was a big fat reconciliation bill that
No,
included.
no,
wasn't
no,
fat
there
at
was
all.
a
It
very
wasn't so
skinny
fat.
reconciliation.
So why don't you
Na-
address
na-
that?
ah.
Because that's a common,
I was
Yes.
gonna
it was
pass.
filibuster proof, though,
I was
right?
gonna pass on your question. I was gonna employ a parliamentarian's tool, and that is, if you don't like the question asked, answer a different question. Or in this case, don't answer the question at all, because these are the policy guys. You know, I'm the nonpartisan process guy. They're allowed to be partisan, so they can speculate on partisan advantage or disadvantage. I can simply comment on process. However, You have tossed me red meat, whether you meant to or not. The ACA, we've heard of the ACA, okay, was not passed using reconciliation. The ACA was filibustered throughout its tortuous course, getting to President Obama's desk. The ACA is public law, my fact checker is going to do this, 111-148, and it consists of 903 pages in slip law form. It was subject to filibusters. Trust me, I know that. It was subject to...
Both times it passed.
It was, well, you say both times.
Yeah.
The ACA was passed once. And I lived through the filibusters. I was driven through snowstorms in Washington, by the way, an inch or two of snow is a storm. I actually slept in my office in the Capitol. I took my silly little dot kit and whatever it was I was sleeping in and sort of padded through the rotunda, looking for a suitable place to shower and shave. You know, the ACA drove over me back and forth, and in part because it needed 60 votes. And the process of considering the ACA on the Senate floor went from right after Thanksgiving right up to Christmas Eve. And as I said, we actually, you know, I kidded about a DC snowstorm. No, we had 3.5 feet of snow at my house, and my 90-pound wife was shoveling the driveway without me. Because I was stuck at the office. So you can imagine what the ACA was doing to my life. And the Senate passed the ACA. Those of you who read the Constitution all the time, as I know a good student at Brown does, knows that revenue bills have to originate in the House. But the Constitution, and I don't remember which section or clause that is, but you've got it there, so you'll let me know. Revenue bills have to originate, well, the Constitution says bills for raising revenue, got it? Raising revenue must originate in the House, but the Senate may amend. And there's some kind of qualifying words there. Raising revenue. The House, of course, treats that constitutional prerogative to affect any bill that raises revenue, reduces revenue, deals with revenue without raising it or reducing it, not to mention all of the appropriation bills which spend the fruits of the revenue. So the House has a very broad take on its prerogatives in that regard. The point being that the ACA or any bill to address American health care is going to affect revenues and therefore had to originate in the House. But time-honored congressional custom and practice has been to permit the Senate to amend a one-line House revenue bill with a 5,000-page amendment. This has been practice. This has been accepted practice regardless of who controls the Senate or who controls the House. So honor is paid to the thought that the House originates, and the Senate does need to wait for a suitable House bill. What that meant is the Senate had an innocuous House revenue bill sitting at the desk when Harry Reid called up multiple versions of what ultimately became the ACA, all of which required cloture. And on Christmas Eve, the Senate, and this was after good staff, friends of Marty, people like Gary Myrick would send me an email with a 900-page amendment and just one question: is it okay? It's like, huh? You know, what in particular did you have in mind from your 900-page amendment? And he says, well, like all of it. And could you get back to me in 20 minutes? But this process played out, as I said, from right after Thanksgiving to Christmas Eve. On Christmas Eve, the Senate finally voted, and these cloture votes were taking place at 1 in the morning as the Senate rules were interpreted with, and Harry Reid was bringing people in at that hour. And the Senate had 60 votes to pass this enormous amendment to this innocuous House revenue bill. And the idea was, well, Christmas is intervening. The Senate will send the ACA to the House, and the House, Nancy Pelosi, then and present Speaker of the House, would have a majority of her caucus, would have her caucus in line, so the House would simply take the Senate's 900-page amendment, and all would be good. And the problem was, over Christmas, a number of flaws were pointed out in the ACA. Provisions derisively labeled the Louisiana Purchase, a provision that was included by the vote of Senator Mary Landrieu of Louisiana. There was the Cornhusker kickback put in there for Senator Ben Nelson's vote, a Democrat of Nebraska, and various other provisions that became a little politically radioactive, and all of a sudden Nancy Pelosi was looking at, well, we can't simply take this lock, stock, and barrel. We're going to have to amend it. And what that means in congressional procedure is if the House amends what the Senate sent it, then it has to go back to the Senate for the Senate to take some action on the House amendment. All is fine so long as the Democrats had 60 senators. If the House amends the ACA, takes out the Cornhusker kickback and the Louisiana Purchase, Harry Reid still has his 60 Democrats, and they can simply approve what the House has done. All is well, everybody's happy. The bill goes off to President Obama, except for one small factor. Who's from Massachusetts here?
So we only have 2 minutes left on, right, I'm sorry, I have to interrupt. We only have 2 minutes left on this answer, Alan.
The
so we gotta-
Massachusetts Senate
speed it
seat was up for grabs in a special election to fill the seat left vacant by Senator Kennedy's death. But it's Massachusetts. There's no way the Democrats could lose that seat, is there, in Massachusetts? Baseball fans here, Red Sox fans, Kurt Schilling, Bloody Sock. Martha Coakley, running for the Kennedy seat as the Democrat in Massachusetts, thought Kurt Schilling was a Democrat. There goes that 60th seat. The Democrats lost their filibuster-proof majority, at which point they said, oh my God, what are we going to do? And what they did was they dusted off reconciliation, and Nancy Pelosi said, I promise you, my caucus, if you pass the ACA as is, can't change it because they can't fix it if you change it, pass it as is, send it back, it will then go to the president for his signature. We will fix it. We will fix it in a reconciliation bill. The only problem with that is a reconciliation bill can't be filibustered. There are a whole host of procedural rules against provisions in a reconciliation bill. Something called the Byrd Rule enables points of order to strip out material from a reconciliation bill, assuming that the presiding officer decides those provisions violate the rule. So who tells the presiding officer what violates the rule? Me. And so, yes, we had to consider a reconciliation bill. I am told I had death threats at my house. I did have police protection at my house. This is what happened.
So just to wrap it up, because I want to give Marty a
Okay,
chance to
okay.
weigh in. So the punchline, Marty, is what happened in March of 2010?
Oh, we lost the majority.
No, March of 2010 is when Obama signed ACA, but there
Right,
were,
he
so-
signed the ACA, but when they lost the Kennedy seat, Pelosi had to go tell their folks, look, and the Senate Democrats went to Pelosi and said, look, thank God we at least, when we passed the budget resolution, we put in, just in case, reconciliation instructions, knowing that just like when Clinton was in the White House, we couldn't use reconciliation to do health care because Byrd Rule, it can only be used for revenue, items that affect revenue or outlays or the debt limit. And so the Byrd Rule is very strict about that. And a lot of the health care, pre-existing conditions, et cetera, didn't have anything to do with federal outlays or revenue. So they had to say, okay, you want to make changes, you got to pass this as is. We can't filibuster, we can't break a filibuster anymore. Take it as is. And then if you've got changes that affect outlays and revenue, we can use reconciliation to make those fixes. They did pass a much smaller, as Alan pointed out, reconciliation bill, and Alan had to approve all the points in it. As a matter of fact, they did find one flaw where a point of order stripped out under Byrd, a small provision out of it. It wasn't a big deal.
Student loans, I think.
And
Yep,
it went
was
back to the
separate.
House, and they quickly concurred in that and sent that bill. Meanwhile, and then the president followed on signing that bill. And so ACA itself was done without it, but the fixes were done with reconciliation.
The ACA was enacted, it was signed March 23rd, 2010. As I said, it's Public Law 111-148. It's 903 pages long. The reconciliation bill is Public Law 111-154, was signed a week later. It is 55 pages, of which 45 pages deal with health care, and the other 10 pages deal with student loans.
So this is a great example. I want to open it up for questions now. It's a great example of how important procedure is to your life.
I was going to say,
Right? I
this
mean,
takes
this
us-
is exactly why this book is so important, why you want to be
Thanks.
empowered in understanding this, maybe never reaching the expertise on this panel,
Yeah.
probably, but I want you to understand that's why, thank you to Professor Moffat for having this panel. This really matters at the core. It may seem really hard to follow, but it matters so much in actually producing programs that provide health insurance or many other benefits for people. So that's why I wanted to open up. But I do want to give everyone a chance to ask you questions. So we have questions for the panelists? I'll just go in order. Yes, down in front, and then also in back. So you'll be number
Yeah,
two.
I'll try to keep this very brief. So like the hyper-formalism of parliamentary procedure isn't the only option for ways to deal with legislative assemblies. Given that this hyper-formalism is rooted in a white Anglo-colonial framework, how do we consider the ways that alternative ways of understanding procedure are available to us, especially if we see that sort of like the volume of precedents, this giant manual, alternative ways that make it actually more accessible to people who don't have a strong formal background in parliamentary procedure.
I'll let Rich take that.
Yeah, Rich, you could
The
take that.
professor will handle that.
Yeah. Well, it's tempting to look at this mess of procedure and what it's given us over the years, and that's not always a system that we're proud of. It's protected behavior by our government for many decades that we're not proud of. But then again, it's the system which dealt with that or began the process of dealing with that. And it's very tempting to look at this mass of procedure and say, I want it simplified. Democracy is simple. You got more votes, you get, the majority always likes to say elections have consequences. And they're very frustrated if they can't just take their agenda and move it. We see that already. By the way, in the last couple of days, you notice that as the Democratic field is beginning to populate for the next 2020 election, the issue of whether or not Democrats ought to do away with the filibuster is already rearing its head in presidential politics. And this is because those candidates running in the Democratic Party, most of them are looking to the progressive side of the party. That's where all the energy has been. And these people are saying, we want to make radical change in the way our government is behaving. Now, full disclosure, I'm a progressive. I like most of those things, but I think it's very dangerous when you just buy the argument that legislative efficiency is a good idea, that a majority is simply figuring out who has more votes. In fact, as we know, part of a democratic system really is protecting the minority. And that's where I started, in terms of understanding these procedures so that you can put them to good use, but not sweep them away. I mean, this is the fallacy. This is what the Democrats did. It's the one big disagreement that Marty and I have. The Democrats swept away this filibuster for judicial nominations in the Senate, and they left us with a situation where not just the Democrats, whoever's in the minority in the Senate, if the president is from the opposing party, they have no leverage. He can appoint whoever he wants to the Supreme Court and be almost certain of confirmation.
Yeah, I want to get to the next question.
Yes.
You've asked a very broad question, and it would take a whole nother panel to answer your question. But I would tell you that one of the key points made by all the panelists today is that the disappearance of the right to offer an amendment on the floor is associated with party control, and as you squash the ability of individual senators to offer amendments, you squash their ability to represent minority, quote-unquote minority or underrepresented views from their state. And so there's a cost to this polarization, and that consolidation of majority power seems great if you're on the progressive side in the Democratic House and you want to do things, but if you actually squash that in the Senate, you squash voices you can't even see all the time. So that's just the reverse of majoritarianism to think about. Do we have another question back there?
Yeah, considering how much politicians enjoy power, I'm curious as to when and why the 60-vote supermajority was put into effect.
Well, it really has its roots all the way back in the early days of the Senate. The filibuster as such didn't exist, and certainly the cloture rule didn't exist until 1918. But there was, 1718, excuse me. 1917, thank you.
It's just a number.
Yeah, really, I'm getting to that age, you know. But even in the early Senate, and one of the reasons why they were willing to do away, the Senate started with, I don't want to take you too far into the weeds, but the Senate started with a motion called the previous question, which virtually every legislative body has. And it's the way that you bring matters to a vote. Well, in the Senate, it didn't really work that way in the early days. The Senate had the tradition of, and it was small, of course, there were only 13 states. The Senate had the tradition that when you ended debate and brought things to a vote was when the senators kind of went, okay, let's vote, shrugged their shoulders. In fact, it was proposed to the Senate that it, in 18, now you'll correct me again, 1806, right. In 1806, it was proposed to the Senate by Vice President Arenberg as he was leaving the Senate, that they dropped this previous question motion. So from that time, 1806, all the way until Woodrow Wilson in 1918, there was in fact no way to end debate in the Senate. Could I do it again?
Yep.
Oh, okay.
Okay, so
You all know what year I'm talking about. Yeah.
And the House actually had that provision up and through, you know, you can argue about that, but about the 1870s, late 1870s, early 1880s, the House also had moving the previous question to end debate. And then they did not have it, I'm sorry, and then they imposed it, starting when the House got really, really big. So the House actually moved in a different direction well into the 19th century from the Senate, but they were more similar. So do we have another question? We have time? We have, I'm going to go female and male, gender balance. We have two more questions, yes.
Hi. Okay, so my question is, it seems like in, especially like the past few years, just the threat of a filibuster has been enough to kind of lead into like this necessity for having enough votes for cloture, like, and it doesn't seem like we get many people actually filibustering. When kind of, and like considering, I feel like a lot of the point of the filibuster is that it's, you know, something that's very difficult to do and that you must care about an issue enough to like go through that difficult process. When do you think this change came about that we don't actually make people filibuster anymore? And if we did, do you think, you know, maybe like some people wouldn't actually follow through?
I'm going to ask Marty to take that question, just from
Yeah.
the leadership perspective.
We would occasionally, I mean, you would, when we were in the majority, and also it works both ways, you would say, well, we want to do X. And they'd say, okay, well, if we invoke cloture, the best you can do is, if we invoke cloture today, then, you know, count 30 hours, and that's when you're going to have your vote. And then they often get a consent agreement now that when they go out of session, the time while they're out of session counts. But sometimes a leader would say, no, that's not good enough. I want to start tomorrow morning. I don't want to start at 6 o'clock tomorrow night. So tell them if they really want to use this 30 hours, then we're going to stay in all night. And if somebody's not here debating, then we're going to put the question. And that's what the chair is supposed to do. If you're not in a quorum call and there's nobody debating the point, then the chair is supposed to say, is there further debate? And if not, questions on the item. Now, when you would tell the other side that, you'd say, okay, let's get our footy pajamas on, it's gonna be a long night. Go tell whoever who wants to filibuster that they're gonna have to be here tonight. And lo and behold, about 40 minutes later, they'd come back and say, well, yeah, you can start tomorrow at 10. Because they didn't want to have to, and it doesn't take a lot of members. Like if Mr. Smith Goes to Washington was a movie. They don't have to talk. They can sit there and read their mail at their desk. But they have to keep a quorum call on, to keep the chair from putting the question. So they can have people come and give speeches, and that's fine with, they don't have to be the one talking. But when that person's done, they have to make sure if that person doesn't put in a quorum call, then they put in a quorum call. And if they want to break and leave the floor, and they were a member of the minority, and we had the chair, and we would tell them, like, if he's going to the bathroom, I'm going to have the chair call off the quorum. So you better have somebody out here to relieve him or her. And so that's why, one of the reasons they don't do it is because, often, I would argue when I was advising the leaders, like, let's do it more often, because then maybe it won't happen as often. But it also discombobulates the majority if you're in the majority, because you need to provide those presiding officers. Somebody has to sit up in that chair for the vice president. And, trying to get somebody to preside from 3 to 4 a.m. is not an easy task, let me tell you, especially if there aren't going to be any votes. And so, the leader would usually, we'd try to cut a deal. We might threaten it, but it's often not done out of, at ease. You just count the time and you move on. And the 60 votes occurred, when cloture started in 1917, it was a 2/3 vote.
Right.
It was lowered, and over the years, it was 2/3 of those voting, 2/3 of those sworn, 2/3 of those voting. And then in 75, it was lowered to 60. And it's been 3/5 of those sworn ever since. So that's how long, that's where that's.
So we have time for one last question. Sorry, one last question, and then we've got a break. So do you want to ask your last question?
Yeah, I would love to. So the discussion of what Harry Reid did in 2013 has been mainly discussed in relation to the filibuster here, but I wanted to ask about the broader application. The procedure he used was overturning the ruling of the chair and reinterpreting the meaning of the cloture rule. Do any of you fear that this sort of procedure for reinterpreting the rules could be used for other rules and possibly continue to overturn supermajority votes? And how would you combat this?
I absolutely fear that, and you can't combat it. If you have a willful majority willing to do this, this is a technique that had been hiding in plain sight for years, but responsible adults didn't dare touch it. This is why they call it the nuclear option. Choose your metaphor. The genie's out of the box. What Reid did was bad, I believe, because of the policy effect, but terribly so because of the mechanism that he used. And you can utilize that mechanism to change every single aspect of Senate procedure. And to me, it's terribly tempting. And it's out there. And Reid, as I said, he let the genie out of the bottle. Nobody was happier about that than Mitch McConnell. You could just see him on the floor of the Senate, November 23rd, 2013, just telling Reid, you will regret this. And he sure as hell has made sure that Reid has regretted it.
I'm going to
But
give Marty.
Reid wasn't the only one.
Yeah.
First of all, the Byrd precedent on going to executive nominations.
Oh, sure. Oh.
It was done by Byrd in 80. You used to be able to filibuster. When you went to executive session, it was non-debatable, but you couldn't go to, you were then on the first item on the calendar, on the executive calendar, nomination or treaty. And Byrd overturned the chair once and said, no, I'm going to this nomination on page 3. The senator who was there on the floor said, whoa, wait a minute, that's against the rules. And Byrd eventually, he had some background as to what he tried to defend himself on, because they'd already done it a couple of times already. And they pointed out, but that person was the first one on the calendar. It was by coincidence. So no. I don't think it should matter. And so they made the point of order against him. He was ruled against because it was wrong, I mean, according to the rules, and he overturned the chair. So ever since then, you can go to anything on that executive calendar. We used to call it the Byrd precedent, but we're the old folk. Nobody up there probably even remembers that that's how the difference in the calendars exists now. It happened twice in the 90s. They overturned the chair. Republicans threw out legislation on appropriations, and they threw out scope of conference by overturning the chair. And the parliamentarians then told us, well, those points of order don't exist anymore, guys. Well, and legislating on appropriations was a big thing because Trent Lott was leader, and he was filling the tree, and we weren't getting anything to offer amendments to. But he did like to do appropriations bills because they were bipartisan, and they were well marbled with earmarks. And so we wanted to get those bills done. Both sides did. And so when he would call those bills up, Democrats could offer their amendments to those because he had thrown out, by overturning the chair, they had supported, it was Hutchison of Texas who made the point of order, they had overturned the chair on legislation appropriations. That lasted for about, I don't know, 3 or 4 years. Same thing with the other point of order. Those were overturned, they were brought back. The Senate giveth and Senate taketh away.
That's a perfect way to end yours. I'm going to give Professor Arenberg the last word before we break for the reception out in the hall and a book signing. So.
Well, I was just going to observe about the nuclear option that probably the worst thing that happened along the history of this that Marty's laid out is when it attracted the label nuclear option. Actually, it's a bit of a misnomer. The Republicans, what the Republicans came up with that tag, and what they said is they were ridiculing what the Democrats were saying to them, that if they use this procedure, then the Republicans, the Democrats, were going to blow up the Senate. And so that became the nuclear option. That label somehow attached itself to the procedure. And once it did, it became it simplified it. As Marty said, or it might have been Alan, this procedure had been laying around in the weeds for as long as the cloture rule has existed. People understood that. At least the procedure wonks did, but they left it alone in the weeds. But once it got that label, it was out there, and people didn't have to understand this complicated, difficult procedure any longer. All they needed to know was there was a switch you could switch called a nuclear option. And if you watch the president talk about this, he says, look, if you got two choices, you can get your thing passed with 60 votes in the Senate, or you can get your thing passed with 51 votes in the Senate. And it's not 51, by the way, folks, it's a simple majority. So it can be as few as 26. Well, okay, so time to stop.
It's time. So I think that concludes. Thank you to the Taubman Center and Professor Moffett for sponsoring this event.